Hey Pioneers, welcome to episode number 454. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about using crops that allow you to preserve food the more in line with the way our ancestors and pioneers did. I don't know about you guys, but one of the things I've been evaluating this year, and maybe it's just 1 year older, aren't we all, aging? I have really been looking at ways and things on the homestead to minimize the amount of work that we have to do where possible. I mean, homesteading is always going to be work. So specifically looking at crops, and maybe it's different varieties, maybe it's trying different things. And it's both for me moving into this year on the preservation mode, but also on the planting mode. And that is looking at things through the lens, like how did they do this 100 years ago? And how can I mimic that? So for example, I mean, they weren't seed starting, at least here where I live in the north, right? Like they weren't seed starting with heat mats, and they weren't seed starting with grow lights and all of those things. So how were they growing these crops without having the ability, specifically with like onions? They were growing onions, but they weren't starting onion sets or ordering onion sets, from half a country or states away or anything like that. They had to figure out systems. So maybe those crops look different. Maybe they're different varieties. But that's kind of the journey that I'm on this year, is playing around with that and figuring that out. So today I thought it would be very fun. In fact, I was looking forward to this conversation so much. It's an awesome one. I know you're going to enjoy it. And it sparked maybe an ongoing series that Don Tipping from Siskiyouseeds and I, maybe we just have a quarterly gardening sesh where we come on and talk about this. So Don has been seed saving and growing for decades. And one of the things we talked about today, because he has a heirloom open pollinated seed company, is looking at varieties and different crops that can be grown that have storage that doesn't require a deep freezer or canning and fermenting. And I'm never going to get away from those things because they definitely have their place, and there would be no way that I would be able to put up the amount of food that we do. Over 70% of our produce or fruits and our vegetables we grow here in a single year and then preserve the excess to feed us for an entire year. And so I will always be using those food preservation methods on certain foods so that we can have them. But what I really would like to look to is how we do with our onions and our garlic and a lot of our winter squash. Is we simply cure those and are able to store them because we've picked appropriate varieties and know the environment they need to be cured, which we're going to go into today's podcast interview in just a minute. But I'm looking to expand that. And so I was super excited to talk to Don. You'll see why when we get to that part of the episode, because there's some crops that are a little more old world or lost, especially here in the United States, practices and varieties that have storage capabilities that aren't winter squash and onions and garlic, but in a very similar manner. So super exciting stuff. Today's show notes you can find with links to everything at melissaknorris.com/454, because it's episode number 454. So if you're watching this on YouTube, there'll be a link beneath here, so you can just hop straight over there. We'll have some links in the video description. But if you're listening to this while you're on the go or on a mobile device, just head over to melissaknorris.com/454 and you'll find all the goodies. Now, today's episode is sponsored by Azure Standard, and sponsors are a wonderful way. I partner with companies that I have already been using their products that I firmly believe in, regardless or not if they sponsor. But sponsorships do allow me to continue to produce this podcast and to offer all of this information for free, which I am so blessed to be able to do and so grateful to be able to do that. But there is an actual operation cost on this end. So that's why we have sponsors, and I'm very picky about my sponsors. But Azure Standard has been a faithful sponsor, and really glad to have them. So Azure Standard, if you're not familiar with them, is a company where you can go online and you place your orders and they can direct ship. The really great thing is they have drops. So it's kind of like a homesteader's Costco because you can order things in really big bulk. They have lots of different size options. So you can get smaller options, which is what I do when I'm trying out a new product for the first time to me, is I'll order it in a small thing first, make sure that I really like it. And if I do, then I order in bulk because one, it is always a cost savings to order in bulk. And then secondly, we've got our food supply. The great thing is they definitely do have food. So crops that we're not growing ourselves here, or I might not be growing a year's worth of yet, I supplement with Azure Standard. It has pretty much replaced a lot of the shopping that I was having to do I simply couldn't find. What I love about Azure is they have the same standards that I do. With the companies that they support that they're not growing themselves on their own farm. And they partner with other small companies that are doing regenerative agriculture that aren't using harmful practices or ingredients that I don't want in my food. And I'm willing to bet you probably don't either. So it's a great resource for that. But again, it's the variety and the bulk of items from both grocery to healthcare, so supplements, as well as different like shampoos and conditioners, body washes. So I use all of those products to actually stock not just our house, but also what we provide in our farm stay, which is like a short-term vacation rental at the farm that's down the road from us that we operate. So if you use coupon code Melissa15, then you will get 15% off your first order of $100 or more as a new customer. In fact, I just placed my January order with them and had to go through and see some of my stock, bulking up on popcorn. I like to get the tri-colored popcorn. It actually has more nutrients and different things in it. Tastes wonderful, pops great. Popcorn is something we're not raising a year's worth of here, but is one of my must-haves. We have popcorn at least once a week. It's a favorite family treat. And so I am getting restocked on that, along with butter. I order my butter from Azure Standard. Butter is one of those things that really doesn't have any other food preservation method except the deep freezer. And because we use so many other food preservation methods, I try to always keep about 20 pounds of butter in the freezer. And so as I start to use that, which I did over holiday baking, then I make sure that I've got that replenished and always stocked up. So check out Azure Standard. I think you will love them as much as I do. And now on to our interview with Don. Well, hey, Don, welcome back to the Pioneering Today podcast.
Good morning. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Well, I'm very excited because since we last talked, I have been able to get to meet you in person at the Modern Homesteading Conference, and we've got to have lots of other conversations. And this one, I feel like we kind of kept going back and forth on Instagram. Like you would post something and then I would post something. And I'm like, we just need to have a really long conversation about it. And so one of the things, a little bit of preface that I'm leaning to more, I don't really know if it's the season in life where really busy with lots of things, getting older, just wanting to return to even older ways, probably a combination of those, but is finding the easiest way to store the crops that we're growing. And I love canning. Like I'm never going to not can. I really do love that. However, I have to say like being able to just cure the onions and garlic and have those in braids or threaded and just being able to pull them. Last night I was actually just finishing shucking the very last of our shelled beans out just to condense in space. I still had them like dried vines in baskets. And so I got those shelled out so I could actually just, put them up on the shelf for condensing space. But it made me start to think like, okay, the winter squash, same thing. I pretty much can cure it and have it last for about 6 to 9 months, sometimes a little plus, depending on varieties. And I'm like, I wonder what other plants that there's different varieties of that would maybe allow for more of this model without having to refrigerate, freeze, can, freeze dry, dehydrate. I mean, some of those things I'll still do, but I'm kind of leaning back, I guess, towards even a little bit more historical methods where possible. And you had really piqued my interest. So I think this will be the place for us to start. And then I think we can branch out into those. But a storage tomato. So talk to me about these storage tomatoes. I'm very intrigued by them.
Yeah. And it's funny that over 30 years into gardening, homesteading, farming that it's new to me as well. I became aware of them about 5 years ago. I have a dear friend named Lane Selman who works for OSU, and she started a program called the Culinary Breeders Network. But her ancestry is from Sicily, so she would go back and forth, and she began to introduce some of us to these Italian varieties of storage tomatoes, mainly through cool artwork of Italian kitchens or Sicilian kitchens, where you'd see these trusses of tomatoes that were kind of saladette sized hanging in the background. And then it was like, what are these hanging tomatoes? Like, who does that? The whole idea, we were kind of groomed to appreciate fresh tomatoes. But
Mhm.
if we go back before refrigeration, before trucking, before the consolidation of the fresh vegetable production in predominantly the southern part of California, Arizona, Texas, Florida, we had to figure out ways to have that kind of culinary diversity in our kitchen. So this year, there were a few folks focusing on the Italian varieties, but I became friends with a woman named Esther who has a seed company in the Catalan region of Spain called Las Refardes. And I had about a half dozen varieties of these Spanish types. And they all had names in Spanish. So I'd never grown them. We grew them out. And it's always interesting when you're meeting a new uh, crop or whole crop type, but you're like, well, when do I pick it? What do I do?
Yeah.
My friend who introduced me to this is in Spain. Um, and then my goal was to save seed because I usually with something like that, like I'll grow enough where I get to know it and be able to save some seed. So next year is going to be our real like big trial of doing the Italian ones and the Spanish ones and seeing, flavor wise. One thing about them is basically sugars are what make tomatoes taste sweet and delicious, but it's also the sugars are what decompose and then they rot. So all of these varieties, I think, are more on the flavor profile of like a Roma tomato or a
Mhm.
paste tomato, and they're a meatier, firmer type. So we have, as I mentioned, about 6 different varieties from like saladette size, where they're maybe an inch and a quarter across, and they form those little tresses or little bunches where they're kind of on a stem. So you can clip a stem and there'll be 8 to 10 of them. Or some of them are a little larger and have an almost like velvety satin color on the skin instead of shiny.
Ooh.
One of them is even called, the name is de colgar, which means hanging in Spanish. De colgar malacara, which means ugly face, which is I don't know the story of how it got that name, but these ones are a bit larger, maybe up to 2 inches. So a sliceable thing, but they'll keep till like February or March. So, I have some in my kitchen just to see how they do.
Yeah.
But what a cool category. Much like you mentioned onions and garlic and things like potatoes and winter squash, we put these up in our pantry and we just have them. So this is adding a whole other species, tomatoes, to that category. And I know a lot of us too might keep chili peppers can
Mhm.
last for a while, or maybe you dry them like ristras. But I'm the same as you. I used to, when I got into all this stuff years ago, wanted to like can dry freeze everything. And then over time, you find like we just don't eat that many pickled garlic scapes, or obscure things. So whittling down to what really works, what kind of meals do you make? And you can look at Italian cuisine where these hanging tomatoes, and I'm less familiar with the Spanish equivalent, things like tricolore pizza, a margarita, or a salad that's basil, mozzarella cheese, and fresh tomatoes. Just these simple things to make nutritious meals. So I'm really excited to begin sharing these more. There's only a few seed sources for these hanging tomatoes, and I think because I'm so embedded in this Pacific Northwest organic seed community through my friend Lane Selman, like we just had a big festival up in Portland called Sagre del Radicchio, and it was 500 people doing a celebration of different radicchios. And
Oh,
this is like
fun.
normal for us, but I forget that most people don't even know what radicchio or chicory or puntarelli or treviso,
Yeah.
are.
So, assuming that there's definitely people listening who probably are like, I maybe have heard that name, but I'm not actually, I don't know exactly what it is, or if I've saw it on the grocery, at the grocery or something, maybe not. So for radicchio, do you want to give just a quick little?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So again, go back to that idea. Imagine if California stopped shipping produce out. What would your grocery store have? So, we'd go back to like 100 years ago where you'd have to grow what you wanted to have. So radicchio and endive and chicory are all kind of related. There's two different species there. And a simple way to view it is winter lettuce that's super hardy that you can plant in the fall and it'll just hang out there. It is a little bitter, but those bitters, as we know, if you understand nutrition and medicinal herbs, help stimulate the digestive process. And there's
Yes.
ways like we're probably familiar with the round like Palmarosa type that is a burgundy red with white midribs,
Yeah.
and they can form almost like a little head of cabbage, real crispy, but they might be bitter depending on the climate where you are. And they can go through some really cold temperatures, like down almost to zero. And they might be all slimy on the outside if you go out there in January or February. But if you
Yeah.
peel away the slime, inside is nice, crisp radicchio. And you can soak this in ice water, remove some of the bitters, and if you like do a balsamic reduction glaze on it and broil it a
Ooh.
little bit, it's
Yeah.
incredible with all kind of things. So I think we're in a pioneer phase of our understanding of what actually grows where we
Hmm.
live. We're
Yeah.
still discovering new flavors. Some people brought things like the radicchios with their tradition, their cultural, culinary cuisine traditions. But we're still formulating that. And that's been a big area of my focus is this whole notion of agrobiodiversity. And I think if I could like wave a magic wand, my whole farm would just become an agrobiodiversity research center and then do farm parties where we do taste tests and bring people in and be like, what do you all think? So I'm hoping to do that next summer with these storage tomatoes, grow every variety I can get my hands on, maybe
Yeah.
15, 20 plants of each, and then bring in some friends that are better at cooking than I am, or more creative perhaps, and do a taste test and maybe even have clipboards, little scorecards. And then that begins to be the seed that we offer going forward and
Yeah.
encourage people to grow. And like, hey, in our trials, these are the best tasting or the ones that actually stored the
Stored.
longest,
Yeah.
because we can all read the catalogs, but unless they're doing variety trials, they don't know. A lot of them are just copy paste, because
Yeah.
I think it's important. One of my mentors said most seed companies are just paper companies. They print catalogs and packets and just need a little floor sweepings to put in it, because most gardeners aren't good enough to know if it was their fault or poor seeds. Whereas
Yeah.
like farmers and seasoned homesteaders and seed savers know if the seed was vital, they know if it was the seed's fault. So that's kind of where businesses like mine, Siskiyou and other farm-based seed companies, we come in, because we actually we eat what we grow. This is part of our lifestyle. It's not just a business. It's um, more of a passion
Yeah.
meets
Well,
hobby.
and it's funny because I feel like I discerned that from your guys' website, because I don't even recall how I found your website, to be honest, in Siskiyou Seeds. I think it was when I was researching medicinal herb seeds that I wanted to grow myself. I think that's how I found you guys, because you guys actually had a catalog. You had
Mhm.
the actual Latin name, like I felt like I could trust, and you had the varieties I was looking for. I think that's how I first found you.
Mhm.
But I mean, I ordered from you guys for years, but I felt that as being able to read the description, seeing what you offered and everything long before we ever met,
Mhm.
it really did come across, and was one of the reasons I got really excited and have been talking about Siskiyou seeds
Yeah.
for years, for those who have been hanging out with me for that amount of time. But on the Spanish storage tomatoes, I kind of want to back up again. So are they indeterminate or determinate, or just like it depends on what variety you're grabbing? Like,
Yeah,
kind of talk to me about their growing habit a little bit.
yeah, because think about that, like in a regular tomato, we're all waiting for that first ripe tomato.
Yeah.
Oftentimes these are determinate varieties or indeterminate that keep on producing pretty much all the way up until frost.
Right.
Whereas and I suppose I could have asked my friend Esther in Spain. He has just limited English skills because they don't even speak Spanish; they speak Catalan, which to them is as different from Spanish as it's Italian or French is. But I kept watching them and being like, okay, you're beginning to get some color, but these ones that were the more like satiny kind of pink color, they didn't look ripe to me. So kept waiting and waiting. And I didn't trellis them just because mostly doing seed, we don't trellis them. So they didn't vine out very far. So they're kind of more on that determinate end of the
Okay.
spectrum. And I believe in witnessing a lot of tomatoes, there's a whole spectrum in between, like highly
Agreed.
indeterminate ones that'll grow 8, 10 feet tall if you keep pruning and trellising them, and the like typical Roma types, if people aren't familiar with those words that just produce one crop, that's it, and they don't vine very much. These are closer on that end of the spectrum. And you can think about it, if they've been selected for centuries, probably since tomatoes came from, the New World, because tomatoes are originally from the Oaxaca, Mexico highland region, and came by 1520, they were being grown in Portugal, Spain, and Italy after, Columbus and that whole Columbian expansion happened. So they were probably selecting those varieties for just like, all right, we're going to clip them, hang them up, and you basically use a thread and you're like tying. If you've ever braided onions, it's a similar
Yes.
approach
That's
to
okay.
produce these kind of, and I'll share some photographs of this with you later so
Yeah.
you can see.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so they're on that more determinate end. So you're harvesting your other tomatoes that you're eating fresh in the summer when they're ready, but these just let them hang out. And as long as you're not like overhead watering where you're risking rot, we grow most of our tomatoes with drip irrigation because they tend to do better
Hmm.
and you have less foliar diseases. So yeah, we were harvesting these like late September, but
Okay.
I'm
And when
sure
did
if we
when
wanted
did
to,
you
we could do it earlier.
okay? And when did you put them in? Just for
We can have frost all
context.
the way till June 1st here because we're zone 8 right up against zone 1, so
I actually can understand that. So
yeah,
yeah, I don't usually plant out until about Memorial Weekend, unless it's in my high tunnel where it's
exactly.
protected, and then I'll
Yeah,
put out a
same
little bit
here.
earlier. Okay, so that's great to know though. So if they're put out as starts
Hmm.
about June, then harvest September, just for date reference. So when you're harvesting them, a little bit of color change, and then after they're clipped and hanging, do they continue to ripen like other tomatoes? Because
Yeah.
I've done that with some where I'm like, "Ooh, a frost is coming, and these guys just are started to blush. I'm just gonna bring them in and keep them in a basket in the corner of the
Hmm.
kitchen and just use them as they go," that type of thing.
Yeah.
And they do continue to actually, get color to them. But are these similar in that same
Yeah, I
way?
think you could actually harvest them at the like when they're ripe, but different from picking individual tomatoes, you'd use clippers and harvest the
The
bunches
whole
or
Okay.
trusses as they're called.
Yeah.
The larger fruited ones made trusses of more like 4 to 6 fruit, and the smaller fruited ones is like 6 to 12 in this nice. And in the supermarkets nowadays, you can see these greenhouse grown tomatoes where they're like on the stem. And I think it's probably mainly a marketing ploy to make them people think they're fresh, but that's a whole other thing. This
Yeah.
is the OG way people did that, and I think leaving the stem on, you're less likely to crack. Some tomatoes, when you take the stem off right there at the attachment point, they'll crack. As you were asking and kind of thinking it through, it made me realize next year, one thing I want to try is measuring with a refractometer. I don't know if you've ever used
I
one of
don't
these.
Okay, no, tell me, what is this?
It's
This
just a
is new.
simple thing that looks like a spotting scope, but you can take a drop or a few drops of juice, either the fruit or plant sap, and it measures percentage of soluble sugars. There's no batteries. You just hold it up
Hmm.
to the sun, and light refracts through sugars through a liquid differently. Because I'm really curious as like, what is the sugar content of these? Because when I remember when I first got a refractometer, I like went around the farm. It was like August and we tried everything, and my kids were doing it with us. So we were mulberries, blackberries, melons, cherry tomatoes, raspberries. And what's interesting is our tongue detects sugars differently. Like raspberries aren't that sweet, they're like 10% sugar.
Yeah.
A sun gold cherry tomato actually has higher sugar content than a raspberry or a blackberry
Really?
because the acids are something that our palate
Oh,
also detects. So, like winter squash, we
okay.
dove deep down this with a group of plant breeders.
Yeah.
Like percentage sugars is one thing, and there's another chemical. It's a group of molecules called dry matter. And you know how, like, if you're eating a winter squash, like the maxima types, like a buttercup or a kabocha, they're real good at first, or a delicata even.
Yeah.
But then by February, March, if you still have them, they're not as sweet. And part of
Correct.
that is the dry matter. There's a conversion of compounds. So I'm curious with these tomatoes if it's a similar
Oh,
thing that, and this harkens back to one of my mentors, Gary Nabham, brought up this point that he said 99%. There's a great book called Where Our Food Comes From, where he explores agrobiodiversity through the lens of the work of Nikolai Vavilov, who by 1910, he was a Russian botanist, had the largest seed bank on the planet. And his whole goal was, in an era before refrigeration and trucking and supermarkets, how do we avert starvation? And it's having more diversity of food crops. But basically, Gary Nabham makes the claim that 99% of the improvement in all of our food crops was completed 300 years ago. And whatever people have done, all the universities, all the GMO guys, and amounts to less than 1%. Because basically our, homesteading ancestors were doing research. They're like, oh, these ones don't last. So here's an interesting thought with the storage tomatoes, and I should probably do this next year.
yeah.
Grow out a bunch, hang them up to store, save the seed that I use for replanting from the ones that stored the best,
Hmm.
because that's how we got to this place. Is if you're always making, incremental improvement in the genetics that you use, just like you were talking about shelling dry beans. Like, imagine if you let's say you had 100 plants and you went through and you're like, these 5 were the most productive ones, I'm going to clip these and set them aside separate as my seed for replanting, and the rest I'm going to eat.
Yeah.
And I think our ancestors, the smart ones, at least the ones that survived, that didn't
Yeah.
starve, were doing this kind of thing. And it's just observation, like our kids could probably help us figure it out. It's not rocket science.
Yeah. So for the storage varieties, when can we get our hands on them?
We have limited quantities of the Spanish
Okay.
types this year. I
Okay.
wanted to there I think we have this code of honor in our, like, small farm-based seed company, that if
Yeah.
somebody's, like, really going for one thing big, like, I think we're the only company in North America that has these Spanish varieties, because it was so obscure. I met this woman at a conference, she came to my farm, she gave me some seeds, like, but otherwise it's a chance encounter. But I wanna, like, respect the, like, turf, if you will. Like, if we're not gonna patent things and trademark, there's a certain, like, I see my friends that have this seed company are really going big on the Italian things, because maybe they have Italian heritage
Hmm.
or just what it is. Where you kind of stay in your lane a little bit. Um, just like I have friends that have seed companies down in the Southeast. They're real big on collards, okra. Those aren't big cultural things here. So I'm not gonna,
Yeah.
like, really do that. Um, that said, there's no rules. And I kind of think these small seed companies, we just, like we were talking about this earlier, we resonate and speak to our audience.
Hmm.
Like, my kids were conceived, born, and raised here on the farm. So that's always been part of our story. Now they're young adults. But for anybody paying attention, they could be like, oh, that's so sweet. It looks like my garden. Like, we're out there with the kids. Whereas other people are coming at it from a different angle, and they're going to resonate with that. So this year we have limited quantities available, the Spanish ones. Next year, I hope to have the Italian ones too. At least I already have seed of a red saladette size one and a gold one that have Italian names that I got from my friend Amy Garrett, who, for those that are really want to geek out on this, she is the head of the Dry Farming Institute
Oh.
near Corvallis, Oregon, and they're doing experiments with melons, tomatoes, squash, a few other things, of plant them, transplant them,
Hmm.
water them once or twice, and just see what happens. Dry beans are doing, and seeing what can do well in a dry farm thing. And not everything's created equal. Some varieties do better than others. Anyhow, Amy is one of my colleagues, and I really admire her work she's doing to, figure this out, because some people live in more water scarce areas, and knowing what varieties work for that is really valuable.
Yeah.
So
I agree. Well, I, I actually am very intrigued by that because it's funny. So my dad was born in the 1930s, so he was an infant and small child during the Great
Mm.
Depression. But they were also quite rural, well, very rural, but also very poor, and so they didn't have electricity when he was growing up, and they had a hand pump in the house for water. And so even when I was a kid, we never watered our garden beyond planting date. I
Mm.
mean, there never was a sprinkler ran because dad didn't grow up that way. You couldn't if you didn't have electricity, right? You couldn't run a sprinkler. And yeah, you could put in a bucket if you had to, like if things got really, like a really, really dry thing. Now, to be fair, we do live in the Pacific Northwest. And so we're usually a bit more wet than other areas for a summer vegetable garden. But even then, here, July and August are usually are dry months. And you can have maybe one day of rain in July and August. So 2 days of rain is not a lot. But dad, he never watered the garden, like hardly ever. Um, and yet historically, again, unless you had your bucket, when we're going or had some things, I mean, most people weren't irrigating their vegetable gardens like the vast majority of home gardeners are today, including myself. I too have, drip hoses for the tomatoes. We're kind of really we really baby our plants to a degree, right? Like we give like our soil is like so dialed in, when if you're giving them, all different types of supplements and everything and just the right amount of water and like all of these conditions that which is great for peak harvest, but I kind of like this is not how food was grown. And if something happened where you couldn't bring in these outside, inputs,
Mhm.
what would these crops do? And what would our gardens look like in a situation where you might not have all the things we do today? And also, I kind of would love a garden that required less of me.
Mhm.
Less garden, not less gardening. I don't mean to say that, but less having to have all of these perfect conditions and try to kind of control that little microclimate inside the garden to be perfect. I I would much rather have plants that would just flourish no matter what.
Mhm.
So I can't. Yeah, that's going to be really exciting to see what they find.
Yeah, and that's I think, we've played around with that a little bit, and sometimes I joke both with our plants and our animals that we're a bit of a Darwinian farm. Like you need to make it. We're not going to totally baby you, like with our sheep. There's sometimes some decisions to be made, about who gets to breed. I guess that's a nice way to put it. And same with the plants. And I think the modern organic farming system, which is really pretty new since I'd say the 80s, this whole idea
Hmm.
and really it's been a logarithmic curve of things like row covers, being able to get organic fertilizers in bags,
Yeah.
or organic, insecticides, fungicides, all this kind of thing. Where if we go back to just not that long ago, 50 years ago, there wasn't any of this stuff. Organic gardening meant composting animal manures, mulching, and picking bugs off and saving seed from the more resilient ones. And like the one of the mentors of one of my mentors was Dr. Henry Munger, and at Cornell, he did a lot of breeding of cucurbits, so cucumbers and melons, among other things like winter squash. And so he was breeding for disease resistance and insect resistance, and he would have his grad students, and this is going back to the 50s. They'd plan out trays of cucumber seedlings, and the grad students would literally taste little bites of the leaves, the cotyledons, and only plant out the non-bitter ones because the cucumber beetles,
Hmm.
that are the biggest pest of all those crops, if you
Yeah.
know about it, are attracted to cucurbitacin, which is a bitter compound. We don't do this work anymore. Every organic farmer I know uses floating row covers,
Hmm.
which I renounced about 15 years ago. When it finally hit me, I was like, if I'm using them, then I'm literally selecting for prima donnas that are going to require this level of treatment. And because
Hmm.
I have a seed company, we have a lot of seed. So instead of planting, let's say, cucumbers every foot to 18 inches, I would literally just use walk behind cedar and plant them every 2 inches and just let the cucumber beetles go to town. You do that for 10 years, and eventually the ones that survive thrive and make seed. And now we never use row covers on anything unless maybe we need it for frost to get some like a pepper seed crop to finish out. But I think that's a tricky thing with modern agriculture. And I think that most people are not aware how fragile it is
Yeah.
and how much most organic growers, if you go to a farmer's market or a, natural food store, if you're not growing it yourself, how much elements of the industrialized food system they're relying upon, crop
Hmm.
supports we call it, to
Hmm.
get that crop out. And this is, it's reality. There's economics. So if we wanted to breed for resilience like the dry farm approaches, your yield is going to be less, or you're
True.
going to have to increase your plant spacing.
Yeah.
Like if you've ever seen pictures of how the Hopi and other Pueblo people did corn bean squash, they planted it every 10 to 15 feet, and so the plant roots could access the moisture in that general area. And so there's different, I kind of see it like there's different dials that we have access to. There's the genetic dial, there's the crop support, one like, oh, frost is coming, are you going to go out and cover the plants or just let them die? There's fertilizer, there's spacing, and then there's our knowledge of like relative location in your garden. Like, okay, I'm going to plant these lettuces and tender greens in the shade of this orchard block so that that late afternoon sun, they're in the shade. So us as land stewards, over time, it takes a while to really listen to what our particular growing site, the conditions of it, the pests, and also if you are adjacent to, like, we're adjacent to a whole bunch of wild forest land, BLM and Forest Service land. So we have owls and raptors and snakes and mountain lions. We have natural predators that are helping keep balance in our system. Whereas if you're adjacent to industrialized agriculture, you could do the same exact thing. Like you and I, we could grow the exact same seeds in the exact same way, but depending on our relative location, it's going to affect the outcome. So, there's no easy answer to any of this stuff. And I think the deeper in you get, you realize like, oh, there's just more to know.
Yeah. I feel, yes, that is very apt. The more I know, the less I know. I know there's so
Yeah.
much more to learn. Yeah, it's kind of funny how that happens. Well, I think what would be kind of fun is I would love to know what some of your varieties for long-term storage, like some of your favorites are. I know we
Yeah.
talked about obviously the tomatoes and that, but I'm thinking, maybe some of your favorite garlic, onion, and winter squash, or anything else that you're able to
Yeah.
do long-term storage wise. I think that would be really fun because I am also curious, like, oh, are they the same as mine, or is this a new variety that I want to
Yeah.
try?
I think, that it boils down to there's certain categories. And being a seed farm, we can only produce seed of certain crops each year if they're cross pollinating. So, like with onions, we just grew, we grew two different kinds because they're biennial. So,
Yeah.
one was producing seed this year and one was producing bulbs. We grew a red Italian storage onion. And here's kind of a funny thing: if a variety, is a bit of an aside, has a name just like Red Keeper, no one cares. But if it's got a name like Chipola de Tropea Rotunda, people are like, ooh, I want that. Even though, like, functionally speaking, they might look and function exactly the same. And this is a bit of marketing. I'm not making up these names. But, I'm curious, like, what was the heirloom red round storage onion in a certain region in Italy for a long time? So that's our red storage. And then for just our own home use, we do a yellow storage. I find they tend to keep a little bit better. And also with onions, and the same applies for garlic. And this is where garlic braids weren't just something pretty to look at. When you cut the top off, you're opening up that stem for there's two different species of mites that are both microscopic that enter into it. And with onions, there's similar things that enter into it. So if you leave the stems long, and there's onion braiding is super fun to do if you're crafty at all and looks beautiful and it's like kitchen art. And it's practical too, because when you need onion, you just go over and twist it off. Same with the garlic, but leaving the tops on encourages longer storage for them. So that's just a little homesteader trick. The hardneck garlics, you can't do that with. And I feel like we got to give honorable mentions to shallots, which we have been producing more shallots,
Mm,
which are onions, technically speaking. They would cross pollinate, but it's a more like
yeah.
primitive, but more mild flavor, and they keep pretty well.
Okay.
So the shallots, I just cut the tops off, and we have a basket of those. And then leeks, which you leave in the field. And leeks are just super keepers. We had potato leek soup the other night, so I was reminded how fantastic leeks
How
are.
nice that is. Yeah.
And then winter squash is a huge one. And my kids, when they were littler, would just be like, winter squash again, come like January, February. But it's just
Uh-huh.
the vegetable side dish we're having all the time. And so we rotate. I usually use the cucurbita. There's three main species that you can grow, and you can save seed from each one. Cucurbita maxima, which is your butter cup type, the dark green one,
Mhm.
orange flesh. Kabocha, that's similar one. Incidentally, the world record pumpkins are all cucurbita maxima. They're not actually pumpkins. We eat those ones first because I find they don't keep as long. And they're my favorite one, I'd say. And then we shift to the cucurbita pepo. We always grow like delicata,
Yeah.
they're just the perfect serving size to cut in half. And I find for us, they'll keep till May or June. And we just have a back
Same.
room in our house. I
Same.
find
Yeah.
that they don't generally winter squash keeps better in a drier environment. So if you're limited on where you could put this, don't put it in a shed where moisture is going to be there, because basically dew collects on it, or moisture, and that
Mhm.
mold, it provides a vector for those mold spores to start. So I remember this one house I lived in years ago, we had a loft and a wood stove. So it was really like warm and dry up there. Winter squash kept way better there than like a cold storage kind of environment. So just little trick of the trade. And then the last species is Cucurbita machata, which is your butternut types. And so those ones I find will keep till July or August for us. And if you've ever had pumpkin pie, it's traditionally made with these,
Yep.
not actually pumpkins. With the cucurbita pepo, it's worth mentioning that's also a spaghetti squash, which I personally don't really care for. Acorn squash, again, which flavor, we've done taste tests and everything, and the delicata just blows everything in it's the same species out of the water, so why grow anything else? So for us, like on Homestead, we settle on our favorites and just try and have those. And if I have to grow seed of another type, like this year
Mhm.
we grew tromboncino, which is a machata type that's harvested young as like a summer squash. So I traded with a neighbor for some butternut because we couldn't grow butternuts because they would cross
They
pollinate.
would cross. Yeah.
So that way in my pantry, I always have the categories we want. And then in terms of other storage things, potatoes, obviously, um, it's just kind of a standby. Interestingly enough, when we mentioned tomatoes, and I just learned this recently, they're in the nightshade family, Solanaceae. So tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, potatoes,
Mhm.
tobacco, and petunias, interestingly enough, along with datura,
Oh.
they all have trace amounts of tobacco. So if you know anyone that is sensitive to nightshades, it's because like tobacco, when you grow it, has about 3% nicotine.
Uh-huh.
Peppers and tomatoes and stuff have about 0.5%. So overdoing
Really?
it or coming in contact with the foliage, if you're on a farm scale, you can have allergic reactions to this because they all have a common ancestor if we go way back, which I just think is fascinating.
That is
And
very
petunias
interesting.
too.
And I would have never guessed petunias, which I actually love. I
Yeah,
love petunias. Have them
totally.
all every year. Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of other storage things, like chili peppers, I like hot sauce and that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
I prefer to store my chili peppers as like lacto fermented hot sauce, because then it's just
Same.
in
It's
your
done. Yeah.
kitchen and you can use it. Although every time I get down to the Southwest, we used to hold the Seed Summit in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it was just so cool, all the ristras everywhere. And it's so dry there, you could keep them outside, so people have all these long ristras of the big, like Anaheim Hatch chilies there. If you do that here, they would just mold. They'd look so ugly.
Yeah, I have one strand of the small red. I'm trying to remember now which variety it was. I have it in my
Mhm.
records. Anyways, but we strung them, but I have them hanging right by our wood stove because that is that hot, dry
Yeah, yeah,
environment. Yeah,
yeah,
and so they're actually, because they're so bright red, it actually almost looks like a Christmas decoration.
yeah,
And so I'm just leaving them there because I'm like, this is the hottest, driest spot
yeah.
that we've got. So I'm going to see how long they last, or I just go in and end up using them all. There's
One
that
trick I've
too.
done, like with the cayenne types, which ironically was developed not in Mexico, where chili peppers are from, but in Hungary. And like the
Oh,
Hungary, Romania, Slovenia area is really into the spicy things. I think because the way the trade routes worked, I mean, that's a whole other podcast topic. It was largely
yeah.
run by Sephardic Jews who were running the Silk Road across North Africa. And then once things began to come from the New World, it worked in reverse. So the cool
Interesting.
spices and ingredients
Yeah.
went back, and cayenne peppers and ristras and all that, that's a tradition that developed in that Balkan region, which is crazy. But if you give it a little nick with a knife, when
Uh-huh.
you string them up, because the
Yeah.
skin that's waxy, it really
Yeah.
resists drying out. And so I found the same things with drying hardy kiwis, raisins. If you like crush them slightly, they
Uh-huh.
dry better. But
Yes.
that skin resists drying
Okay.
out. So
Well, actually,
um,
I threaded my needle and thread through the very center of the pepper, so
oh, okay, smart.
it did pierce it. But I actually
Yeah.
I because when we had harvested them, I didn't have enough stem left on some of them. Like it was barely there. So
Yeah.
it was apparently I did it without knowing that that would be the benefit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one thing, like mentioning the dried chili peppers, and I was in Kenya doing kind of some seed support, almost like missionary work there this spring. And they make use of a lot of biopesticides, is what they called it. And so
Mm.
this is basically plants that they'll dry and powder and mix with water
Oh,
to spray to control pests. And they're in a tropical environment, so bugs go crazy and there's all kind of stuff.
yeah.
But one thing I'm really learning, I'm about to move into year 25 on my site here, is that new pests show up. And you're like, we never had these before. Because with climate change
Hmm.
and things, or you
Yeah.
move nursery stock around, like I have citrus in one greenhouse, and I brought in scale, two different species of scale. I'm like, what do you do about scale? They're like aphids or something.
Yeah.
So they would use, I don't know if you know the flower Tithonia or Mexican sunflower. It was one of their favorites. And they
Okay.
dry the flowers, much like a pyrethrum are a
Yeah.
chrysanthemum. So
Yes.
I'm
Yes.
really intrigued.
Okay.
We have these new blister beetles that are really messing with dahlias, asters, calendula, and they just kind of showed up. And I've talked to a few friends that are observant, and they're like, yeah, I have those too. And
Two.
they eat out the center of the flower.
Oh.
So I want to play around maybe with like dried chili peppers, dried tobacco leaves in a like a slurry, and
Yeah.
spray it on there and see,
See what happens.
yeah. So
Yeah. That is
I don't like buying
interesting.
stuff.
Yeah, I know. I don't either. That is very interesting though because I don't have the opportunity to talk to a lot of people who've been on the same gardening place for that many years too.
Mhm.
But I definitely am also seeing some shifts and different things from, 20 something years ago when we first started too. So I like talking about them and like, okay, this is what they're doing here. Like, let's try
Yeah,
these. I think yeah. Yeah. Well, you'll have to let me know how
yeah.
that works. Yeah.
Mhm.
Which slurry is the best.
Yeah. And then in terms of like other storage things, I mean, we got to give honorable mention to like apples, pears, Asian pears.
Yeah.
We're not growing those from seed, but we have a walk-in cooler here because we have a few hundred fruit trees, so it's pretty important to have that, which is basically a fancy, well-insulated root cellar with a drain in the floor so we can hose the whole thing down. In wintertime, I unplug the cooler because it's just not necessary. But that having something like that, as we're mentioning storage, just upgrading your storage game, whether it's an area of your garage, sometimes it's airflow. Again, you want certain things want cool and dry. Other things like apples want cool and slightly moist. If
Hmm.
it's too dry, whereas a winter squash is like cool or dry, but dry more important than cool. So learning to dial that in, you generally don't want to keep potatoes in the same space as other things, or apples in the same space as potatoes, because fruit is off gassing ethylene gas and is going to make things ripen. So like the commercial tomato industry, they pick a lot of things underripe and green because it will transport better out of the field, and then they put it in
Right.
a warehouse and gas it with ethylene to get them to ripen. So you want to get your storage game down, because then you just have fresh food over a longer time of the year. And that's always been one of my permaculture goals, is how to have fresh things, everything, as for as long of the year as possible. So like we're still eating persimmons and pomegranates that we grew here, and it's almost the new year. And I love that. And so these categories, whereas like July or August, you're in September, you're overwhelmed with food.
Hmm.
Like having things that happen then is not nearly as important as the shoulder seasons outside of that. And especially like ironically, I feel like May is the like least abundant time.
Yeah.
And so when we used to have farm interns, they would come and think that they were like walking into the Garden of Eden. They'd come in the spring. And I'd be like, sorry, there's like not much happening. It's a lot of like kale and potatoes that are getting a little shrivelly and
A little bit of asparagus
things like sunchokes.
and
So when
stinging
fava
nettles.
beans, yeah,
My stinging nettles are phenomenal crop in
yeah,
May.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, stinging nettle lasagna, spanakopita, enchiladas, all that. We love it.
Yeah.
And
So,
I'm working on my next podcast, and it's the topic is agrobiodiversity. And right now, what is it? I have it written down right next to me. 200 species feed most of the world, but there's 4 species that provide 60% of the calories, which is corn, rice, wheat, and potatoes. But there's over 8,000 species of edible plants that people eat around the planet. So for your area, like like the radicchio, what can you
mhm.
include? Which, there's storage things that we bring in our homes, but then there's storage things, crops that just hang out in the field.
Yeah.
We still have potatoes in the ground. I just haven't gotten
Same.
around to dig them up.
Yep.
But I mentioned leeks, cabbage, kale. What can be out there that you can, and it depends if you get deep snow or not, if you
Yeah.
can access it. Similarly, in our high tunnel greenhouses, I'll plant peas in November. So albeit not a storage crop, but just a little bit of protection. Then all of a sudden we're eating fresh snap peas in February and March, which is a very welcome
Yeah.
thing.
Is that a heated high tunnel
No,
or no?
no, just a
Oh,
single layer plastic and it works awesome.
okay. I might try that one this year. I've overwintered lettuce in my high tunnel and it's
Yeah,
done well. Actually, the more snow we have, because the more insulating that actually ends
yeah,
up
yeah,
being, has been a benefit. But that's done really well for me. But I haven't tried doing the peas in it. So yeah,
yeah.
that's a
Fava
fun one.
beans, all kind of things you can do in there. And again, I think it's worth mentioning that not all varieties overwinter equally. Like some varieties of spinach do better than others over the winter, some varieties of lettuce. And also, if you haven't tried like overwintering cauliflower, like we have here in the Northwest, purple sprouting broccoli has become a bit of a phenomenon. So you plant that in July, it grows into a nice plant, but it's making nice heads of kind of this dense purple broccoli in March and April, that's awesome. So
Yeah.
figuring out, kind of mapping out your calendar and like, what am I going to have in my pantry? What am I going to have in my like root cellar, garage, storage condition? And if you don't have that, get it together, like create that, because that's where the rubber meets the road. And I think back about like, Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits or something, and like unexpected guests. What do you have that you can break out? And you go back before refrigeration and grocery stores, which are both modern things, and there was cheese with a rind, there was dried apples, dried pears, something that you can put up, in these various storage crops. And that's right, the hanging tomatoes, just to come full circle to that, for one, what a welcome sight when you walk into somebody's kitchen that has garlic braids, onion braids, the hanging tomatoes.
Yeah.
There is just, not only is it abundance, but there's something, the peace of mind and security that goes along with that. And I think there's something that shifted even in our brain around that we all came from hunter gatherers that didn't have to worry about this stuff, because when you wanted food, you just went out and hunted or gathered. And then as we became agrarian, wealth was storage crops,
Yeah.
grain, and that kind of thing. And I mean, that's a whole topic of a book that I have yet to discover. Somebody should write this.
Well, I
Um,
think you should write it. I think we should
yeah.
talk. Yeah.
Whereas you look at now, I think probably a lot of people's PTSD and like all the stuff that we're, leaving like chemicals and all these other things out of the discussion, is because people are relying on grocery stores for their most basic needs. Well, for one, water, they don't even know where their water comes from. But food, like how much food does your average person keep in their home? And that is the sense of security.
Hmm.
Um, maybe the Beatles shouldn't have said happiness is a warm gun. They should have said like happiness is a larder stocked with
Well,
food.
I think there's actually something. This is actually really funny because last night I was shelling out, as I said, the last of our dried beans. It was my last basket of dried beans, and I was getting it shelled out. And my husband was like, the kids can help do that. And I'm like, oh, I know they can. I said, but honestly, I said, I love to do this in the evening. It's very meditative. But as I was doing it, I was like, I think that the reason that this so relaxes me is because going back, it is the security aspect. Like, I know as I do this that this is going to provide food for us. This is our seed for next year's crop. And it also is very repetitive. So there is something that's kind of meditative about it. I
Yeah.
find it super, super relaxing. So I'm like, no, I need to relax tonight. I'm going to do it. Like, I've got this
Yeah.
one. But yeah, same thing, like to the pantry. I always tell people when they first start canning, because that's one of the forms of food preservation I teach a lot. And I'm like, it is totally normal. And you should do this when you're done. You will find yourself just standing there, opening the cupboard door wherever you have them stored, and you'll just admire it. Like, you'll look at it as a work of art and like it's totally normal, but expect to do it. But I think you're right. I think there's there's something deeper there happening with that we've maybe aren't being cognizant of until having this type of discussion. I think you're
Yeah,
right.
because that was like the most normal thing for
Yeah.
all of human history until like I remember kind of like a case in point, there was this old guy that used to travel around with a mobile butcher, and he was 88 years old at the time. And interesting hobby to want to travel around with a butcher, but whatever. And he was talking about before I-5, the main like north-south
Hmm.
highway here in our region was built, it wasn't completed until 1967. And he said that everyone used to raise a cow or a pig and have a chest freezer and put it up because deep snows would shut down the highway. There's a pass near us that goes up to about 4,500 feet on the freeway. And he said that would be shut down for 8 to 12 weeks every winter. And he's talking about as a boy in like the 1950s and 60s. So
Yeah.
if you didn't have a backup, the grocery stores started to run out of food. And it wasn't this whole modern grocery store paradigm. And that's in one person's lifetime. We've seen that shift.
Hmm.
And I'm glad you bring up dry beans. And one thing that I'm trying to get in the habit of is because I've always loved growing fava beans, is get into figuring out how to use dried fava beans because you can make a like Pacific Northwest adapted hummus. Because growing chickpeas kind of
Hmm.
works here, but I don't find them really productive.
Yeah.
But fava beans you can steam and mash. Or the very first time I had fava beans was the broad types, steamed lightly, and it was with a family with Persian Iranian heritage, and we would dip the individual beans in a mixture of sea salt and angelica root powder, which is so
Oh.
cool. So here's something you can grow. Fava beans are so easy to grow. They're
Uh-huh.
super easy to thresh out. And then you can store them like that. And they'll store for years. Like the thing is like dry beans, dry corn. We didn't even get into all the grains. We grow a
We
lot of
didn't.
flour corn and popcorn.
Yeah.
And those will store as long as you don't have meal moth problems for years. And then you have that security of like the proverbial, you're in the Hobbit village and people come by, you can bust out your homegrown popcorn and be having a really nice snack that takes very little time and is, because the expansion rate is concentrated. So
Yeah.
I think for each of us, figuring out what are the constituents that comprise like an abundant food security.
Yeah. Well, this has been really fun. And we'll put in the blog post, we've got links to quite a few of the different things that we've been talking about. And also, Dawn's been very generous. So we've got a coupon code. So you guys can grab all of that from the blog post. We'll put that in there that accompanies this episode. But Dawn, I think maybe we just need to like have a quarterly joint discussion.
Yeah.
I think there's so much to talk about it. Every time we talk, I'm like, oh, like I could literally probably just talk to you about these subjects for hours. So I think, yeah, we'll definitely have to have you back on, and maybe we'll just
Thanks.
make this like, yeah, a regular occurrence because there's so much to discuss here, even in the realm of what we talked about today. Like there's some areas I'd love to go deeper on. So thank you so much for coming
Yeah.
back on.
Yeah. You're
Yeah.
welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that episode as much as I did with Dawn, and super excited for us to have further conversations. So if you have got questions you would like to see Dawn and I tackle, please leave them beneath this video. If you're watching it on YouTube, you can leave it as a review. If you're listening to this on an app with the podcast, or if you're on the blog post, then go ahead and leave that in the comments beneath there. Would love to see those. And Dawn has offered a special coupon code of 10% off at Siskiyouseeds using Modern Homesteading. So all one word, Modern Homesteading is the coupon code for 10% off. And if you happen to see this little yes, you running around, if you're watching this on the video part, we do have a new kitten here at the homestead. Somebody was supposed to be a barn cat, but has ended up, everybody has fallen in love with her. And so she pretty much has full reign of the house right now. So that is her debut. I call her Hoppity because she is a very rambunctious kitten and is always hippity hoppiting around. So I call her Hoppity, even though it's not her official name. It is from me. I hope you guys are having a fabulous new year, and I've got a lot of really fun episodes planned and coming your way. So blessings and mason jars for now, and I'll see you back here next week.